The pasuk begins in Bechukosai Teilechu. If you walk in my statutes, that's mitzvosai tishmru, and you observe my mitzvos, vasitzmosam. Rashi. So first Rashi had said, when it says in Bechukosai Teilechu, is this referring to the fulfillment of the mitzvos? Yochel zekiyam mitzvos. Shu omer mitzvosai tishmru. But the pasuk continues, says, and if you observe my mitzvos, harekim mitzvos, omor, omani mekayim and b'chusay teilechu. So what is the beginning of the pasuk referring to? Sheitu ameilus b'Torah. That when you study Torah, it's not just enough to study it. You have to study it in the context of ameilus. You have to toil in Torah. What does that mean? Have ameilus b'Torah amnas lishmor l'kayim. That when you're ameil in Torah, when you toil in Torah, it's you with the objective to fulfill the mitzvahs. Gemara in Kedushin tells us the Gadol at Talmud, why is study of Torah so important? And it cites this pasuk in the Rambam, and Hilchos Talmud Torah cites the same pasuk. Limartem osam, Gadol Talmud Shehameivi Maaseh. Great is the importance of the study of Torah because it brings to actualization. When you study, you merit a special siyata d'shmaya. It's not just becoming knowledgeable. To be able to succeed, to be able to make the correct decision. I had mentioned, what is choice? Choice is always when there's no alternative. If you see something with a level of clarity and you understand there is no alternative, you make the right choice or you have no choice. When you study Torah, we say, Barosi Yitzhak Torah Tavlin. The Torah, it's the antidote to the Yetzer Hara. It gives you the ability to see the value, the importance of what you're studying. As a result of that, you do the mitzvah more easily. Now, what determines to what degree, what siyata d'shmaya you merit when to do the mitzvah more easily? Torah is a tavlin. Torah is the antidote. It gives, as the Gemara quotes a pasuk, Shlomo says in Mishlei, Ner mitzvah Torah or. The Torah is an illuminator. It illuminates something. It gives you clarity. The degree of clarity you have, the degree that you're able to internalize it, is based on the ameilus Torah. As we're saying, Gadol Talmud, Shehameivi Lidei Maaseh. Greater is the study of Torah. It brings to actualization. Now, what determines to what degree of actualization it brings? If you study the Torah with ameilus, with the explicit purpose to fulfill the mitzvah, that means that study of Torah will give you a level of clarity that you'll internalize it to a degree that you should be able to fulfill the mitzvah. So you should study the Torah with ameilus for the purpose and the sake of doing the mitzvah. Rav Kalatsky in Nefesh HaChaim cites a Zohar that the whole concept when it says in Pirkei Avos, mitzvah goreres mitzvah. I've mentioned this many times in the name of Chaim Voloshin. When you do one mitzvah, it engenders you should do another mitzvah. So Zohar says that when you do a mitzvah, it creates a certain energy, and the majority of that energy is removed from this world, and it's put in a location which is referred to as the world to come. And every time we do a mitzvah, the energy which is generated through the mitzvah goes to the world to come. When a person passes away, whatever that time might be, what's Olam Haba? Olam Haba is the accumulated energy of all the mitzvahs that you've done through your life. That is the Olam Haba. There's no location called Olam Haba. The Olam Haba is determined by what you accomplished, what levels of energy you generated, and all those spiritual energies which you created or removed from this existence, and it goes to this location, and that determines what type of olam haba you have, what level of relationship you have with Hashem. That's the concept. He says, however, although that the majority of the energy is removed from this world, there's a trace of that energy which remains with the person. That trace of energy encourages you and draws you to do more of the same. So after you do the mitzvah, it's not now, there's no remnant or no effect of the mitzvah. No, there's an effect. There's a trace of that energy which remains with you. That energy motivates you to do more of the same. That's the concept of mitzvah gores mitzvah. Aver gores avero. When a person does an avero, you generate an impure energy. Ruach, a contaminated energy. After you do that, it removes itself, it's removed from this world. A trace of that impurity remains with the person. And that draws him, it's like an addiction. If you have a foreign element associated with you, and you begin craving for more of the same, and that it's Avero Gores Avero. So we explained, when we speak about Gehenna, there's no location called Gehenna. Gehenna is determined based on the level of impure energy that the person created as a result of his transgressions. Okay, that's how he explains, based on the Zohar, mitzvah gores mitzvah, one mitzvah engenders another mitzvah, and Avero Gores Avero. And one sin engenders another. He says, however, even before you do the mitzvah, when the person thinks in his mind that you can do a mitzvah, Hashem gives you a siyata d'shmaya to be able, there's already an energy created to allow you to overcome the hump. Because since a person naturally is a physical being, and there's a certain inertia, and you can't get going, so to say, so to get you out of the gate, when you think that you want to do the mitzvah, there's already a level of purity, pure energy which comes upon you, which gives you that motivation, pushes you to be able to actualize the mitzvah. That's Rav Chaim Volozhiner. Now, when we say ner mitzvah Torah or, the Torah is the illuminator. Over here we see the Rambam, the Rashi cites the posuk, Es mitzosim tishmoru. Since the pasuk says "V'limart bosam u'shmartam hasosam," you should study them. There's a link. You should study and doing the mitzvah. You should be lilmod maslasos. So when you lilmod to do the mitzvah, you should be lilmod with ameilus to do the mitzvah. So that means that the level of energy which you create to be able to do the mitzvah, it's a different level of energy. It's done with ameilus, it's one level. Because it has a level of purity in it, of dedication, and this goes into what we speak about the Fum Tsar Agra, the Mishnahs and Pirkei Avos. When you meet a challenge, and the challenge is more difficult because of the difficulty, that determines the degree of value. And despite that you do it, that will determine your level of reward. The more you go against the grain, the greater is the value of it, because that indicates you value it and you esteem it to a greater degree. So if you go in your omeil, you toil in Torah the way the Torah is alluding here, this is the Yogato Motzosa Tamin. So it's not only Yogato Motzosa to come upon the truth of Torah, but when you study, in either case, it should always be done with ameilus, because when you do it ameilus, it brings about a different result. It generates a different quality energy. To be able to do the mitzvah differently, to do the mitzvah l'shmo.
Rabbi, so when we say,
One second. It says in Pirkei Avos that if you consider three things, you'll never sin. One is before who you will stand to give a reckoning. Before who you will give a din v'cheshbon. That's the Mishnah, Pirkei Avos. The din and cheshbon, the judgment and the computation. So everyone asks a question. Before the court gives a verdict, they have the evidence, they evaluate the evidence, and based on the evidence, you have the verdict. So the Mishnah should say, before whom you will stand to give cheshbon v'din. There'll be a cheshbon, there'll be a calculation, an evaluation, and based on that evaluation of the evidence, there'll be a verdict. But the Mishnah doesn't say that. It says din v'cheshbon. First there's a din, and then there's a cheshbon. So how do we understand it? That's the question which is asked. So the Vilna Gaon explains, and the Chofetz Chaim cites the Vilna Gaon, that din means whatever good you did in your life, you receive reward. That's din. God forbid, for the sins, there's din. Now there's a new level of evaluation, a computation. At the time that you did the sin, if you could have done a mitzvah at that time, let's say a person chose to waste an hour, and during that time, he could have studied 1,000 words of Torah. There's a calculation made. What loss did that sin cause? At the time that you sinned, you could have done a mitzvah. So there's the din on doing the sin, and then there's an additional calculation, the mitzvah you could have done while you had done the sin. That's the cheshbon. So the Vilna Gaon says it like this. The Vilna Gaon says that for every word you study Torah, when we say Talmud Torah keneged kulam, every word is keneged kulam. So he says if you study 1,000 words, that's 1,000 times 613. It's not you study for an hour, you study a subject matter, those subject matter is the equivalent of 613. No, every word of that subject matter that you study is keneged kulam. So let's say in an hour, you should have been studying, rather than studying, you sinned. Since, let's say he speaks about you spoke Lashon Hara. During that moment, well, it's unjustified to speak Lashon Hara. You should have been studying, speaking in Torah, not speaking Lashon Hara. So not only are you held accountable for speaking Lashon Hara, but there's a computation that when you spoke to Lashon Hara, you should have been saying words of Torah. So there's many words of Torah that you could have studied during that period of time, you're held accountable. That's the cheshbon. That's how the Chofetz Chaim explains what the Vilna Gaon says. That's din v'cheshbon. There's a din on the wrong, and the cheshbon of what you could have done during the time that you did the wrong, what you should have done right. Person has a right to work. So when you at your office working, you have no obligation to study. So there's no cheshbon, because when you're working, you have no obligation to study. But when you have the obligation to study, evidently, when you speak Lashon Hara at that time, you're taking out time to do something you shouldn't be doing. So you should have been studying at that time. What you speak Lashon Hara, therefore the cheshbon, the computation, is for the mitzvah you should have done during that time. That's how the Chofetz Chaim explains, based on the Vilna Gaon, the din v'cheshbon.
I'm sorry, so
good.
So in the framework that a mitzvah creates an energy, the vast majority of which goes into Olam Haba, but a trace remains here in this world, and the opposite for a sin, where does the concept of tshuva come in as it relates to eliminating the sins that you conducted?
Okay. The Torah, the Gemara tells us, the Medrash tells us, that the concept of tshuva was created before creation. The whole existence is predicated on that the human being has the ability to correct, since a human being is inclined to fail, to sin. That's why we find, Chazal tell us, we find Bereshis Bar Elokim. Elokim is the appellation of Midas Adin. And because Hashem saw, because man is prone to fail, man will not survive the precision of justice of God. Therefore, he coalesced into Midas HaRachmim. Part of Midas HaRachmim is that a Jew has the ability that if he has remorse and he makes a commitment, he's not going back there, it eradicates and vaporizes the result of sin. And not only that, you're credited for doing tshuva. That's all chesed Hashem. That's within the context of chesed. So this energy that was left this world, the negative energy, which is in the world to come, which ultimately is the Gehenna, which the person has to deal with after he passes away. But if one does tshuva, that tshuva brings about a result as if it vaporizes that negative energy and the person is totally cleansed. There's no trace any longer of that negative energy if the person did a proper tshuva. We find on Yom Kippur, the mitzvah, the Rambam says in Hilchos Tshuva, throughout the year, there's no obligation to do tshuva whatsoever. The Rambam says if you do tshuva, he prescribes exactly how it should be done and what it accomplishes. Yom Kippur, Rambam says there's a chiv to do tshuva. There's an obligation to do tshuva. Why? Because it says in Torah, Lifnei Hashem Torah. Before God, you should purify yourself. That is the whole concept of Yom Kippur. It's a day of atonement that he says that since it's the last moment, because God will give the ultimate verdict now on Yom Kippur, therefore you have an obligation to straighten out your record before. Lifnei Hashem Torah. So what's the result of doing tshuva on Yom Kippur? Besides Yom Kippur contributing to that purity, the person is purified. There's no trace of that sin that you had done throughout the year or whatever you did. You're cleaning up your act to the point it's Lifnei Hashem Torah. You bring about the end result is purity as if there's no trace of whatever took place in the past.
So, and
The Rambam says that Hilchos Tshuva, based on pesukim, that a person was a rush his whole life. And the last moment before he passes away, he does tshuva, the negative record is totally erased. It's based on a pasuk. And he says, if a person was a tzaddik his whole life, and the last moment of his life, he says, I regret that I ever did a mitzvah. I want nothing to do with my past. The record is obliterated. And when he comes before the heavenly court to be judged, there's no mention of any of his good deeds. Just in the negative, tshuva eradicates the record if the tshuva is done at the last moment. Identically, if the person, God forbid, has regret for the mitzvah he done, there's no mention of the mitzvah whatsoever, of any of his good deeds that he did in the past.
But if according to Mark, it's an asymmetric upside. I like that.
No,
Why does that mitzvah that he put in the bank in Olam Haba, how does this go away?
Good. So let's explain it. Based on Reb Shlomo Hyman, which we once discussed, there's a famous Tosas position in Sukkah and in Brochos that if you hold mitzvahs ain't shrichas kavona, that if you do a mitzvah, even if you don't have intent that you're doing it for the sake of the mitzvah, you're accredited for the mitzvah. It's an argument in the Gemara. Mitzvah shrichas kavona, mitzvahs ain't shrichas kavona. So Tosas' position is that even if you hold mitzvahs ain't shrichas kavona, if you have in mind that when you do the mitzvah, you don't want to be accredited for the mitzvah, it's considered as if you did not do the mitzvah. For instance, the Torah tells us that when you take the 4 species on Sukkot, you have an obligation to take 4. That's the fulfillment of the mitzvah. Positive mitzvah, taking the 4 species. Now, rabbinically, every time we do a mitzvah, it's always predicated on a bracha. So Tosas asks, when you take the 4 species, if you hold mitzvah saying shrichas kavana, the moment you lift up, you take the esrog in your right hand, the lulav in your right hand, the esrog in the left hand, and you hold it, you fulfill the mitzvah immediately. Even though you did not intend to do the mitzvah, you already fulfilled the mitzvah. Mitzvah saying shrichas kavana. So if that's the case, how do you say the bracha after you've taken it? How do you say the bracha? You already fulfilled the mitzvah. You always say the bracha prior to the mitzvah, not after the mitzvah. That's Tosas' question. So Tosas gives 2 answers. One answer Tosas gives that you have in mind when you take it initially, before you take it to him, you don't want to be Yotzei the mitzvah. So contrary intent allows that even if your mitzvah ain't shrichas kavana, you do not fulfill the mitzvah. Or the way we do it, we take the esrog, we invert it, because you only fulfill the mitzvah only if you take it in its direction of growth. So since the esrog, when it grows, the pitum is upward direction. So when we take it inverted, initially you haven't taken it correctly. That's when we say the bracha, and then after we say the bracha, we turn it upward, and then we waive it. That's the second teretz. That's second answer to Tosas. But the first answer is, and this is Tosas consistent with his position, that if you have in mind you don't want to be Yotzei the Mitzvah, you're not Yotzei the Mitzvah. So there's a question which is asked. The Gemara we had studied once in Eruvin. The Gemara says that even if your mitzvah ain't shlichus kavana, you're a violation of Baal Tosef. Because even if you don't infuse it with the kavana, it still has the value of a mitzvah. So if you see over there that even if you have a negative intent, you're in violation of what? Of Baal Tosef. You're adding to the mitzvah. That's a question which is asked by the Shagas Harry. Because the more over there has a discussion on the fine tefillin on Shabbos. How many pairs of tefillin could you wear at the same time to transport it from public domain to private domain? So Mor says, if you hold mitzvah shichas kavana, you can't take more than one pair at a time. So the Shagas Harry asks, according to Tosas, have in mind that you don't want to be outside the mitzvah. Because by having in mind, you're negating its value. So Shlomo Hyman answers, it's two separate things. To fulfill a mitzvah, that needs to be accredited. If I want to give you a gift, and you say, I don't want the gift, even if you put it in my hand, if I reject the gift, and don't have in mind I want to acquire it, the gift is not the recipient's gift. So that's regarding, are you Yotzei? If you don't want to be Yotzei, you're not Yotzei. God doesn't force himself on anybody. I don't want to be Yotzei. But in terms of the representation of what you did, is it an act of a mitzvah? An act of a mitzvah, it's an act of a mitzvah. So regarding Baal Tosef, even without the infusion of intent, it already has a representation of mitzvah. So once you do it in a way which you're adding, you're in violation of Baal Tosef. Are you accredited? Credit is something else. I don't want to be accredited. You don't want to be accredited? God says that that's the case, I will accredit you. So therefore, by taking the lulav, the four species I don't want to be accredited. If that's the case, you're not accredited. And now he said, now I'm ready. So now you're ready, so now you're accredited. So a person has a life of Torah mitzvahs, and right before he passes away, Chas v'sholom, he has in mind, he regrets everything. He wishes he never did a mitzvah. So now it's a question, you're worthy to have a relationship with God in the world to come because of all that you've done. God's person, I don't want a relationship, I want nothing to do with you. God says, so if that's the case, we have no relationship. That's the concept over there. But in terms of remorse, tshuva, that's a whole different discussion. If you have remorse and you make a commitment and you're sincere before a person passes away, although he lived a life of sin his whole life, the record is totally rehabilitated, obliterated, and there's no trace and no mention of that evil life that he had led in the past. Yeah.
Is the mitzvah for taking the four species beyond just holding them in your hand? Isn't there a requirement to wave them, and therefore you haven't really completed the mitzvah if you just take them?
Good question. There's a Tosas of Psochim. What the Tosas I quote right now is a Tosas of Sukkah. There's Tosas of Psochim that asks this question that if you're mitzvah and shlichus kavanah, the moment you take the four species, you already fulfilled the mitzvah. So Tosas answers that you may have fulfilled the mitzvah on a Torah level, but there's still a rabbinic mitzvah to waive it. Waiving is a rabbinical mitzvah. So the mitzvah is not yet complete. So although you already fulfilled the mitzvah of taking the lulav on a Torah level, since there's a continuation of rabbinical to waive it, therefore you're still able to say the bracha, although you already fulfilled the mitzvah. That's what Tosas answers in Psalm. Exactly what you're saying.
Rabbi, there were times where people conducted themselves that way?
The Yisod V'Shesh Avoda, the famous story with Count Potocki.
Right.
He was the prince of Poland, and he was going to be the heir. And he converted to be a Jew, and he was put to death because he converted. And the Franciscan order that put him to death said, because you're the heir, you're the son of the king of Poland, will give anybody else we put to death. But if you denounce Judaism and you openly re-embrace Catholicism, you're not going to be held accountable. And you could assume the throne of Poland. He says, no, I will die sanctify God's name. The Vilna Gaon said to him, he had studied with the Vilna Gaon. His name was Avram ben Avram. He says, I'm able, if you want me to save your life, I could take you out of here with saying a Kabbalistic incantation, and I could put you in another part of this world, and you'll save your life. He says, no, if this is what I have to contend with, I'm willing to sanctify God's name by giving my life. And this famous story how he was burnt to death. Thousands and thousands of non-Jews came, gathered to see exactly how he was killed, how he was burnt. So the Yisod V'Shesh of Avoda is a work I mentioned in the past. Yisod V'Shesh of Avoda, his name was Rabbi Zan Ziskin. It's a work based on the Kabbalah of the Kavona of the weekday Tefillah, Shabbos Tefillah, Yom Tov Tefillah, Rosh Hashanah Kippur. The Vilna Gaon said on the Yisod V'Shesh of Avoda that he was a person who was a chosid. He was so devout, so pure. So what did he do? He went and he wanted to be present when they burnt him. When they burnt Count Petotsky, why?
Gather his ashes, probably.
No, he wanted to be present. Why? Because when he's going to say the bracha, Asher Kidshanu Mitzvot Tzivot Al Kiddush Hashem, he wants to answer Amen on that bracha. That bracha is going to be so special, he wants to be there. And so he went and he disguised himself as a Pole, dressed in peasant's clothing, covered his face so they didn't see that he looked like a Jew. And he was there to be able to answer Amen on that bracha. I'm just bringing out that point. He answered Amen on the bracha. Afterwards, the Vilna Gaon gave him the order to gather the ashes because they had to be interred because the Goyim, they should be strewn all over the street, the marketplace to disgrace him. Vilna Gaon says, go there and I will say a Kabbalistic incantation. You'll be protected. They won't even notice you. Just gather it. And it was buried in the Vilna cemetery. That's the story.
Yeah, his yard site is now Shavuos.